Most people believe they would recognize danger if they saw it. They believe guilt reveals itself through panic, that grief announces itself through collapse. That innocence sounds like desperation. But what if none of those signals appear? What if the most disturbing cases are not defined by violence, but by emotional absence? This is not a story about rage, cruelty, or loss of control. It is a story about stillness, about silence that does not crack under pressure, about a mind that remains unchanged while everything around it collapses. Because sometimes the most unsettling question is not what someone did. It is what they never felt. When Laci Peterson disappeared, the public did not immediately assume the worst. In the early days, there was sympathy for Scott Peterson. Viewers saw a husband speaking to reporters, standing beside search volunteers, answering questions. On the surface, he appeared cooperative, present, calm. But very quickly, something else began to dominate the conversation. It wasn't evidence. It wasn't contradictions. It wasn't even his words. It was his stillness. Human beings instinctively look for emotional cues in moments of crisis. Long before we analyze facts, we read faces. We listen to tone. We watch posture, timing, hesitation, and emotional leakage. These signals help us decide who is trustworthy and who is not. And when a person's emotional response does not match the gravity of the situation, discomfort emerges almost immediately. Scott Peterson did not behave the way people expected a desperate husband to behave. He did not appear frantic. He did not appear disorganized. He did not appear emotionally overwhelmed. Instead, he spoke slowly, carefully. His voice rarely changed. His facial expressions remained controlled. Even as the situation escalated, even as the stakes became unbearable, his emotional presentation stayed remarkably consistent. At first, many people explain this away as shock. Shock can temporarily numb emotion. It can flatten response. It can delay visible grief. In the immediate aftermath of trauma, emotional shutdown is common and understandable. But shock is not static. Shock evolves. As time passes, emotion usually breaks through. Anxiety surfaces. Fear leaks out. The body reacts even when the mind tries to stay composed. Most people cannot sustain emotional neutrality when their world is collapsing. Scott Peterson did. Days passed, then weeks, then months, and the stillness remained. This is when the public reaction shifted from confusion to suspicion. Because emotional consistency under extreme stress is not typical. It is not how most emotionally attached people respond. Regardless of innocence or guilt, even innocent people fluctuate. They spiral. They collapse and recover. They alternate between hope and despair. Their emotional state is unstable because the situation itself is unstable. Scott Peterson did not fluctuate. And that consistency became more unsettling than any single lie could have been. People began to ask questions they didn't yet know how to articulate. Why doesn't he look afraid? Why doesn't he look broken? Why doesn't his emotional state change as things get worse? These questions didn't emerge from logic. They emerged from instinct. Because emotional response is how we judge sincerity long before evidence is introduced. And Scott Peterson's emotional response felt absent. This absence mattered because grief is not just personal, it is social. Society has unspoken rules about emotion. We expect love to look a certain way. We expect grief to sound a certain way. We expect loss to leave visible damage. When tragedy strikes, emotional expression becomes a form of social proof. Tears signal attachment. Desperation signals fear of loss. Collapse signals humanity. When those signals are missing, the silence itself becomes suspicious. Scott Peterson did not violate legal expectations at first. He violated emotional ones. And emotional violations are often judged more harshly than factual ones because they feel threatening. They challenge our assumptions about how people are supposed to feel. This is why Scott Peterson unsettled people before they ever decided what they believed about the case. It wasn't that he said the wrong things. It was that he did not feel the way people expected him to feel. And when emotional performance is absent, people assume deception, even when they cannot yet explain why. But here is where the story becomes more complicated, because emotional absence does not always indicate calculation. Sometimes it indicates structure. There is a critical psychological difference between suppressing emotion and lacking emotional attachment. Suppression is effortful. It requires control. It produces tension. The body resists suppression. Stress builds. Cracks form. Microexpressions leak out. The emotional system pushes back. Absence does not behave this way. Absence is quiet. Absence is stable. Absence does not strain under pressure. Scott Peterson's stillness did not look like someone fighting emotion down. It looked like someone for whom emotional intensity never fully arrived. This distinction matters deeply, because if Scott Peterson were suppressing grief, we would expect moments of failure, sudden emotional surges, visible strain, behavioral inconsistency. But across interviews, police interactions, public appearances, and time, his emotional presentation remained largely unchanged. That kind of consistency is extremely difficult to fake, not because people cannot lie, but because sustained emotional suppression is exhausting. Structure, however, is not. When emotional detachment is part of a person's baseline psychological makeup, their response to crisis does not dramatically shift. Stress does not create chaos. It creates further withdrawal. Instead of unraveling, the individual becomes more contained. Instead of reacting outwardly, they retreat inwardly. This is why Scott Peterson's behavior disturbed people on a level deeper than reason. It suggested not emotional control, but emotional distance. And emotional distance is far harder to interpret. Anger explains itself. Fear explains itself. Grief explains itself. Distance does not. Distance offers no emotional access point, no leverage, no reassurance. When someone remains emotionally untouched by tragedy, we begin to wonder whether they are anchored to the same moral and emotional world as everyone else. This is not a judgment. It is a human response. We fear what we cannot read. And Scott Peterson became unreadable very quickly. The stillness that surrounded him was not loud. It did not demand attention. It simply persisted. And in a case defined by absence, the absence of a woman, the absence of answers, emotional absence felt like a mirror of the crime itself. By the time suspicion hardened into belief for many people, the emotional verdict had already been reached. Not because of evidence, but because Scott Peterson never appeared to break. And whether consciously or not, the public began to ask the most unsettling question of all. What kind of person can remain emotionally unchanged when everything they are supposed to love is gone? That question would haunt this case from that moment forward. And it is the question that shapes everything that follows. Emotional detachment does not appear suddenly in adulthood. It does not emerge in moments of crisis, nor is it created by a single traumatic event. In most cases, it forms quietly, gradually, and almost invisibly, long before anyone would think to call it a problem. To understand Scott Peterson's emotional stillness, we must first understand how a person learns to live at a distance from emotion in the first place. For many people, emotional connection is reinforcing. Vulnerability is met with comfort. Expression is met with understanding. Over time, the nervous system learns that emotion is safe, even necessary. But not everyone has that experience. Some people grow up in environments where emotion is ignored, minimized, or subtly discouraged. Others learn that closeness brings pressure, conflict, or loss of control. And some discover that emotional expression simply does not change outcomes in any meaningful way. In these conditions, the mind adapts, not by becoming broken, but by becoming efficient. Instead of reaching outward, the individual turns inward. Instead of expressing emotion, they analyze it. Instead of relying on others, they become self-contained. This is not a conscious decision. It is a learning process. And over time, emotional detachment becomes less of a defense and more of a personality structure. Psychologically, this shift is subtle. There is no dramatic withdrawal from society. The person does not become antisocial or dysfunctional. In fact, many emotionally detached individuals appear highly functional. They work, they socialize, they form relationships. But emotionally, those experiences do not carry the same weight. Connection exists without depth. Interaction exists without resonance. Emotion exists without urgency. What develops instead is emotional economy, a way of moving through life while expending as little emotional energy as possible. From the outside, this can look like strength. Detached individuals often appear calm under pressure. They do not panic easily. They do not become emotionally overwhelmed. They seem composed when others fall apart. But composure is not always resilience. Sometimes it is distance. As this pattern deepens, emotional engagement begins to feel unnecessary, even uncomfortable. Intimacy can feel intrusive rather than comforting. Emotional conversations feel inefficient rather than meaningful. Instead of processing emotion externally, the individual learns to process internally, or not at all. This internal orientation becomes the core of the emotional life. Thought replaces feeling. Planning replaces reacting. Control replaces connection. Over time, the person stops expecting emotion to guide decisions. Instead, decisions are made cognitively, procedurally, and often without emotional consultation. This is where emotional detachment becomes stable. Not because the person chooses it, but because it works. It reduces friction. It reduces vulnerability. It reduces dependence. And because it works, it persists. Importantly, this form of detachment does not eliminate emotion entirely. Emotion still exists, but it is muted, distant, and often difficult to access. It may appear in fleeting moments, quickly contained, and then set aside. Rather than shaping behavior, emotion becomes background noise. And when emotion no longer drives behavior, something else takes its place. Control. Control over exposure. Control over emotional demand. Control over how much of oneself is accessible to others. This is not dominance. It is insulation. People with this emotional structure do not seek to control others. They seek to control their own emotional environment. They prefer predictability over intensity, distance over closeness, autonomy over attachment. This is why emotionally detached individuals often gravitate toward relationships that appear stable but emotionally shallow. The relationship exists, but it does not demand deep vulnerability. And as long as emotional demands remain low, the structure holds. But when life introduces unavoidable emotional pressure, grief, responsibility, loss, or permanent change, the system is tested. For most people, crisis forces emotion to the surface. For emotionally detached individuals, crisis does the opposite. It deepens withdrawal. Rather than breaking down, they retreat inward. Rather than expressing distress, they reduce emotional output even further. This is not denial. It is disengagement. And disengagement can be profoundly misunderstood. Because from the outside, it looks like indifference. But psychologically, it is avoidance, not of responsibility, but of emotional overwhelm. This distinction matters when we look at Scott Peterson. If emotional detachment had been part of his psychological structure long before Laci disappeared, then his behavior during the crisis was not a new development. It was an intensification of an existing pattern. This explains why his emotional presentation did not evolve. It explains why increased pressure did not produce visible emotional strain. And it explains why his stillness remained stable even as the situation deteriorated. Emotionally detached individuals do not rise to emotional crises. They step away from them. This stepping away is often misinterpreted as calculation or coldness. But calculation implies intention. Detachment does not require intention. It simply exists. Over time, this emotional structure can create a dangerous gap between action and feeling. When emotional engagement is limited, consequences are processed intellectually rather than emotionally. Harm is understood conceptually, not viscerally. This does not remove moral awareness, but it weakens moral restraint. Emotion often acts as a brake, slowing behavior, introducing hesitation, forcing reflection. When that brake is weak or absent, behavior becomes easier to execute without internal resistance. Again, this does not cause violence, but it removes internal barriers that typically prevent it. Understanding how emotional detachment forms is essential because it reframes how we interpret behavior under stress. It reminds us that not all dangerous minds are chaotic. Some are quiet, some are emotionally absent, and some move through the most devastating moments of life without visible disruption. Not because they are strong, but because they are disconnected. This emotional disconnection is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It simply persists, and once established, it shapes every response that follows. Schizoid personality traits are often misunderstood because they do not look dramatic. There is no chaos, no emotional volatility, no obvious instability. Instead, there is quiet functionality. People with this emotional structure often move through life without attracting attention. They hold jobs, maintain routines, form relationships, and participate in society in ways that appear normal on the surface. There is no obvious sign that something is missing. But what's missing is not competence. It's emotional depth. In real life, schizoid traits reveal themselves not through what a person does, but through how little emotional weight those actions carry. Relationships exist, but they do not anchor. Events happen, but they do not land. Consequences occur, but they do not resonate. This is why schizoid personalities are so difficult to recognize. There is no crisis to point to, no breakdown, no moment where everything falls apart. The detachment is consistent, and consistency is easy to overlook. In everyday interactions, emotionally detached individuals often appear reserved rather than cold. They listen more than they speak. They share little about their inner lives. Conversations remain surface level, focused on facts rather than feelings. This is not secrecy. It is limitation. There's simply less emotional material to access. When asked about feelings, responses may sound vague, muted, or oddly neutral. Not because the person is hiding something, but because the emotional signal itself is weak. Over time, this creates a recognizable pattern. Emotional conversations are avoided, not out of fear, but out of disinterest. Intimacy feels unnecessary rather than threatening. Vulnerability feels inefficient rather than meaningful. The individual does not crave emotional closeness. They tolerate it. This tolerance allows relationships to exist without depth. The relationship functions, but it does not transform the person emotionally. There is no sense of being anchored to another human being. For most people, relationships shape identity. They alter priorities, reactions, and emotional states. For schizoid individuals, relationships remain external. They are part of life, but not central to it. This is why many schizoid individuals can appear surprisingly calm during emotionally intense events. Their emotional system is not wired to escalate in response to relational stress. What others experience as overwhelming, they experience as distant. This detachment becomes especially visible during moments that typically provoke strong emotional reactions. Loss, conflict, responsibility, change. When faced with these events, emotionally engaged individuals react instinctively. Their emotions surge, fluctuate, and demand expression. Schizoid individuals do not surge. They withdraw. They narrow emotional exposure even further. They become quieter, more internal, more self-contained. This withdrawal is often misread as strength. But psychologically, it is avoidance. Not avoidance of reality, but avoidance of emotional overload. Another defining feature of schizoid personality traits is a strong internal world. Many emotionally detached individuals live primarily inside their own thoughts. They imagine scenarios, rehearse conversations, construct futures that feel safer than the unpredictable emotional demands of real life. This internal world is not fantasy in the sense of delusion. It is planning. It is abstraction. It is emotional insulation. When life becomes emotionally demanding, retreating into thought feels safer than engaging with feeling. This internal orientation creates a crucial psychological imbalance. Thought becomes dominant. Emotion becomes secondary. Action becomes procedural. Decisions are made cognitively, often without emotional consultation. The individual understands outcomes intellectually, but does not feel them viscerally. This is why emotionally detached individuals can make decisions that appear cold or baffling to others, not because they lack awareness, but because emotional resonance is weak. They know what should matter. They just don't feel it the same way. In social settings, this can create subtle friction. Others may feel that something is missing, that the person is present but not fully engaged, that there is a distance that cannot be crossed no matter how much time passes. This distance is not intentional. It is structural, and once established, it does not disappear under pressure. In fact, pressure reinforces it. When emotional demands increase, the system tightens. The individual becomes more withdrawn, more controlled, more internally focused. This is where schizoid traits become most visible, not in everyday calm, but in crisis. Because crisis exposes emotional wiring. For emotionally engaged people, crisis amplifies emotion. For emotionally detached people, crisis minimizes it. This inversion is deeply unsettling to observers. We expect crisis to reveal humanity. We expect emotion to surface. We expect reaction. When reaction does not occur, we assume something is wrong. But psychologically, what we are witnessing may simply be consistency. The same emotional structure operating under different circumstances. This matters enormously when applied to Scott Peterson. If schizoid traits were part of his baseline emotional makeup, then his behavior during Laci's disappearance was not an anomaly. It was alignment. His calmness was not strategic. His restraint was not calculated. His emotional flatness was not performative. It was familiar. People with schizoid traits do not experience emotional escalation the way others do. Their emotional range remains narrow, even as circumstances intensify. This explains why Scott Peterson's demeanor did not shift dramatically as public scrutiny increased. It explains why interviews separated by weeks or months feel emotionally similar. And it explains why observers struggled to locate emotional authenticity in his responses. Because authenticity, in this context, did not look like emotion. It looked like absence. This absence is not malicious, but it is consequential. Emotion serves a critical social function. It signals attachment, vulnerability, and shared humanity. When emotion is muted, others struggle to connect, and struggle breeds suspicion. People do not trust what they cannot emotionally read. And when stakes are high, emotional unreadability feels dangerous. This is why schizoid personalities often feel more unsettling than openly aggressive ones. Aggression announces itself. Emotion explains itself. Detachment does neither. It leaves observers projecting meaning into silence. In Scott Peterson's case, that silence became louder than words. And once silence is interpreted as concealment, every action that follows is filtered through that assumption. Understanding what schizoid personality looks like in real life is essential because it prevents us from mistaking emotional absence for intentional manipulation. It does not absolve behavior, but it clarifies it, and clarity matters, especially in cases where emotional expectation plays a central role in judgment. Because not all dangerous minds are expressive. Some are quiet, some are distant, and some move through the most emotionally charged moments of life without visible disturbance. Not because they are immune to consequence, but because they're disconnected from emotional gravity itself. That disconnection is not dramatic. It is subtle, and it is often invisible until everything else is gone. Human beings are not neutral observers of emotion. Long before we evaluate facts, we evaluate feeling. We read tone, facial expression, posture, hesitation, and emotional rhythm instinctively. This process happens automatically, often without conscious thought. Emotion is how we decide who is safe. When someone responds to tragedy in a familiar way, we relax. Even if the situation is terrible, recognizable emotion reassures us that the person is anchored to the same emotional reality we are. But when that emotional response is missing, something fundamental breaks. This is why emotional absence disturbs people more deeply than anger or chaos ever could. Anger explains itself. Fear explains itself. Grief explains itself. Emotional distance does not. Scott Peterson unsettled the public because he violated an emotional expectation so basic that most people never articulate it. The belief that devastating loss must visibly alter a person. When that alteration does not appear, the mind searches for explanations, and it rarely lands on emotional structure. It lands on deception. This reaction is not irrational. It is evolutionary. Human survival has always depended on reading others accurately. For most of human history, emotional signals help distinguish ally from threat, grief from guilt, sincerity from danger. We are wired to treat emotional inconsistency as risk. When someone does not react as expected, our nervous system activates. We become alert. Suspicion grows not because we want it to, but because our instincts tell us something is off. Scott Peterson did not trip this alarm because he behaved aggressively. He tripped it because he behaved neutrally. Neutrality in moments of extreme emotional demand feels unnatural. It disrupts our internal model of how humans are supposed to work. And when our model fails, discomfort follows. This discomfort intensifies when emotional absence persists. A single calm moment can be explained away. A pattern cannot. As Scott Peterson continued to present the same emotional flatness over time, the public response shifted. What began as unease hardened into judgment. People stopped asking, "Why is he calm?" They started asking, "Why doesn't he feel anything?" This shift is psychologically significant. Once emotional absence is interpreted as lack of attachment, it becomes morally loaded. The person is no longer simply different. They are perceived as deficient. And deficiency, in this context, feels dangerous because we assume that attachment is what restrains behavior. We believe people refrain from harm because they care about others, about consequences, about loss. When care is not visible, we worry that restraint may be missing too. This is where emotional absence becomes threatening, not because it proves wrongdoing, but because it removes reassurance. Scott Peterson did not reassure people emotionally, and reassurance is what most of us rely on to feel safe. Another reason this kind of mind disturbs us is that it resists interpretation. Emotionally expressive people are readable. Even when they lie, their emotional system leaks information. Stress appears. Fear surfaces. Contradictions show up in tone and timing. Emotion gives us something to work with. Detachment gives us nothing. When someone remains emotionally flat, we lose our primary tool for understanding them. We cannot tell what they care about. We cannot tell what motivates them. We cannot tell what hurts them. This unreadability creates anxiety, and anxiety seeks resolution. When facts are unclear, emotion fills the gap. In Scott Peterson's case, the absence of emotional signals allowed projection to flourish. Viewers projected intent, motive, and meaning into silence. Silence became interpreted as concealment. Calmness became interpreted as confidence. Restraint became interpreted as control. Whether those interpretations were fair or not, they were psychologically predictable. Humans distrust emotional blanks. Another deeply unsettling aspect of emotional detachment is that it challenges our belief in emotional universality. Most people assume that deep loss will feel devastating to everyone. We project our own emotional experiences onto others and expect similarity. When someone does not mirror that experience, it creates cognitive dissonance. We are forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. not everyone feels the way we do. And if emotional experience is not universal, then moral experience may not be either. This realization is deeply destabilizing because it undermines the comforting idea that shared feeling ensures shared restraint. Scott Peterson's emotional presentation forced people to confront the possibility that attachment is not guaranteed, that caring is not automatic, and that absence of visible feeling does not require explanation. It may simply exist. This possibility is more frightening than malice. Malice can be understood. Malice has motives. Malice has emotion. Emotional absence has none of those anchors. It is a void, and voids invite fear. This is why emotionally detached individuals are often described as cold or empty, even when they behave politely and calmly. The description is not about behavior. It is about how others feel around them. People feel unseen, unacknowledged, unconnected. In high-stakes situations, that feeling intensifies. When Laci Peterson disappeared, the public wanted emotional alignment. They wanted to feel that Scott Peterson's inner world matched the gravity of the situation. They wanted confirmation that he was suffering in a recognizable way. They never got it, and that absence of shared suffering created distance. Emotional distance that quickly became moral distance. Once moral distance is established, trust collapses. Every subsequent action is filtered through suspicion. Every calm response becomes evidence of something darker. This is not because the public is cruel. It is because humans rely on emotion to make sense of danger. Another reason this emotional structure disturbs us is that it disrupts narrative. We understand stories through emotional arcs. We expect rising tension, emotional peaks, collapse, and resolution. Scott Peterson's emotional arc was flat. There was no rise, no visible breaking point, no emotional release. Without an arc, the story feels unfinished. And unfinished stories provoke obsession. People keep returning to the case, not just for answers, but for emotional resolution that never arrived. This is why decades later, the case still feels unresolved on a psychological level. Even for people who believe the legal questions are settled. Emotionally, nothing ever closed. Finally, emotional absence unsettles us because it forces self-reflection. When we see someone who does not feel what we would feel, we are forced to confront the fragility of our assumptions. We want to believe that love guarantees behavior, that attachment guarantees morality, that feeling deeply prevents harm. When someone violates those assumptions, it shakes our sense of safety. Scott Peterson became disturbing not just as an individual, but as a symbol of emotional unpredictability, a reminder that emotional depth is not universal, and that absence, when paired with responsibility and power, can be dangerous. This does not mean emotional detachment causes violence. It means emotional detachment removes a layer of protection we assume is always there. And when that layer is missing, we feel exposed. That feeling, more than evidence, more than testimony, is why this case continues to haunt people. Because it confronts us with a possibility we would rather avoid. That some people move through the world without the emotional anchors the rest of us rely on. And when something terrible happens, they do not break. They remain still. And stillness, in moments of devastation, feels more threatening than rage ever could. At this point, one question becomes impossible to avoid. Was Scott Peterson suppressing emotion? Or was emotional attachment never deeply present to begin with? This distinction matters more than almost any other question in the case, because it changes how we interpret everything that follows. Most people assume that when emotion is missing, it has been intentionally hidden, that the person is holding something back, that beneath the surface, a storm exists, carefully contained. But psychology does not always work that way. There's a profound difference between suppression and absence. Suppression is active. Absence is passive. Suppression requires effort. Absence requires nothing. And the two leave very different psychological fingerprints. When someone suppresses emotion, the body resists. Stress accumulates. Tension leaks out in subtle ways. Changes in voice, posture, timing, microexpressions. The emotional system pushes back against containment. This is why sustained emotional suppression is difficult to maintain. Eventually, something gives. Emotion breaks through. Absence does not behave like this. Absence does not strain. Absence does not leak. Absence does not escalate under pressure. It remains stable. Scott Peterson's emotional presentation showed no clear signs of internal struggle. There were no moments of visible strain. No sudden emotional spikes followed by recovery. No oscillation between control and collapse. His demeanor did not fracture. Instead, it stayed consistent across interviews, across time, across increasing pressure. This consistency is psychologically significant because consistency suggests baseline. It suggests structure. It suggests that what people were witnessing was not an effort to contain emotion, but an emotional system that simply did not generate much intensity to begin with. This possibility is deeply uncomfortable because it means Scott Peterson may not have been failing to express emotion. He may have been expressing exactly what was there, and what was there was very little. This does not mean he did not understand the situation. It does not mean he was unaware of the consequences. It does not mean he lacked intelligence or comprehension. It means that emotional attachment, the visceral pull that binds most people to loss, fear, and responsibility, may have been weak or absent. This realization forces us to re-examine a core assumption we rarely question, that emotional depth is universal. We assume that all people love deeply, that all people grieve intensely, that all people experience loss as devastation. But psychology tells us otherwise. Emotional experience exists on a spectrum. Some people feel intensely, some moderately, some faintly, and some operate largely without emotional gravity. This does not make them inhuman, but it does make them different. Scott Peterson's case forces us to confront this difference directly. If emotional attachment was limited long before Laci disappeared, then his response to her disappearance was not a failure of character in the moment. It was the continuation of a lifelong pattern. This reframing does not absolve behavior, but it changes the psychological narrative. Instead of asking, why didn't he react? We are forced to ask, what was there to react with? This question becomes even more troubling when we consider responsibility. Emotion is not just about feeling, it is about restraint. For most people, emotion acts as a regulator. It introduces hesitation. It creates inner conflict. It forces reflection. Love complicates decisions. Fear slows action. Guilt interrupts behavior. When emotional attachment is weak, those internal regulators lose power. Choices become easier to execute because fewer emotional barriers stand in the way. Again, this does not create violence, but it removes friction, and friction is often what prevents irreversible actions. This is why emotional absence becomes so significant when paired with responsibility. A person can understand consequences intellectually and still feel disconnected from their emotional weight. They can know what they are risking without feeling it. This gap between knowing and feeling is where moral failure can occur quietly, without rage, without panic, without emotional collapse. And that possibility unsettles us because it challenges a comforting belief that feeling deeply is what keeps people from doing terrible things. Scott Peterson's emotional presentation forces us to consider a darker truth. That morality is not guaranteed by emotion alone, and that emotional detachment can coexist with outward normalcy for years, unnoticed, unchallenged, and unexplored. Another reason this question matters is because suppression looks different under pressure. If Scott Peterson had been suppressing emotion, we would expect deterioration over time. As scrutiny increased, we would expect emotional leakage, frustration, defensiveness, exhaustion, irritability. But his demeanor remained strikingly similar. Pressure did not change him. Time did not change him. Public judgment did not change him. This stability suggests not control, but emotional inertia. There was nothing pushing outward, nothing to contain. This is why the public struggled to reconcile what they were seeing. They expected emotion to force its way out. When it didn't, they assumed deception. But deception is not the only explanation for emotional absence. Structure is another. And structure is harder to detect and harder to accept because structure implies permanence. It suggests that this was not a momentary failure. It was a way of being. This realization reframes Scott Peterson not as someone who chose emotional detachment in crisis, but as someone who may have always lived this way. And if that is true, then the tragedy did not create emotional absence. It exposed it. This exposure is why the case feels so unsettling even decades later. People are not haunted solely by what happened to Laci Peterson. They are haunted by what Scott Peterson's emotional presentation suggests about human variation. That some people may walk among us, functional, polite, composed, without the emotional anchors we assume everyone shares. And when those anchors are missing, behavior becomes unpredictable in ways that frighten us. Not explosive unpredictability, quiet unpredictability, the kind that does not announce itself, the kind that does not warn. This chapter exists because it marks the psychological turning point of the documentary. Up to this moment, we have explored emotional absence as a pattern. Now, we must confront what that pattern means. Because if Scott Peterson was not suppressing emotion, but operating from emotional absence, then everything we interpret next, his lies, his decisions, his calmness, must be understood through that lens. This does not answer whether he committed the crime, but it answers something else. How someone could move through devastating circumstances without appearing to be emotionally changed by them. And that understanding prepares us for what comes next. Because emotional absence is not neutral once moral choices enter the picture. It becomes consequential. And as we move forward, we will see how this emotional structure intersects with responsibility, decision-making, and moral failure, without ever producing the emotional collapse we expect. That is the question we can no longer ignore. And it is the question that defines everything that follows. When psychologists analyze behavior, they do not focus on isolated moments. Anyone can perform briefly. Anyone can lose control once. Anyone can appear calm for a single interview or break down under unusual circumstances. What matters is baseline. Baseline is how a person behaves across time, pressure, and changing environments. It is the emotional default they return to when nothing else is forcing a reaction. Scott Peterson's emotional baseline is one of the most striking aspects of this case. From the earliest public appearances to later police interactions and courtroom footage, his demeanor remained remarkably consistent. His tone stayed measured. His speech remained deliberate. His emotional range appeared narrow, even as the stakes escalated dramatically. This consistency is critical because emotional states driven by effort tend to fluctuate. Fatigue sets in, stress builds, control slips. But Scott Peterson did not visibly slip. When Laci Peterson was first reported missing, his calm could be attributed to shock. When media attention intensified, it could be attributed to composure. When suspicion mounted, it could be attributed to confidence. But taken together, across weeks, months, and different settings, the calm stops looking situational. It starts looking structural. In interview after interview, Scott Peterson's emotional presentation followed the same pattern. He spoke without urgency. His voice rarely rose. His facial expressions remained restrained. His body language showed little agitation. There were no dramatic spikes of panic. No visible emotional escalation. No moments where fear appeared to overwhelm control. This absence is not subtle when viewed longitudinally. Most people, even those attempting to manage their image, show emotional variability under sustained pressure. Stress creates noise in behavior. Anxiety distorts rhythm. Fear introduces inconsistency. Scott Peterson's rhythm did not distort. This is why the term emotional baseline matters. Because baseline behavior is not something people consciously choose in each moment. It reflects how their nervous system processes stress and emotion by default. For emotionally engaged individuals, baseline shifts under threat. The system reacts. Fight or flight responses activate. Emotion floods the body. For emotionally detached individuals, baseline often does not shift dramatically. Stress does not produce emotional intensity. It produces further withdrawal. Scott Peterson's behavior aligns closely with this pattern. Rather than appearing overwhelmed, he appeared procedural. Rather than appearing emotionally activated, he appeared internally focused. Rather than reacting to the emotional weight of the situation, he seemed to manage it cognitively, through words, plans, and outward structure. This does not indicate intelligence or strategy. It indicates emotional distance. One of the most revealing aspects of Scott Peterson's baseline is how little it changed in response to worsening circumstances. As media scrutiny increased, most people would experience emotional erosion. Even composed individuals eventually show cracks, frustration, defensiveness, exhaustion, irritability. But Scott Peterson's effect remained largely unchanged. He did not appear increasingly agitated. He did not appear increasingly desperate. He did not appear increasingly emotionally reactive. This suggests that emotional pressure was not accumulating internally. Because when pressure accumulates, it leaks. The fact that it did not leak implies there was little pressure to begin with. Another important factor is how Scott Peterson communicated. His speech patterns were controlled, often careful, but not rushed. He did not appear compelled to fill silence emotionally. He did not over-explain. He did not attempt to emotionally persuade. Emotionally expressive people tend to speak differently under stress. They ramble. They repeat. They attempt to convince through intensity. Scott Peterson did not. His language remained measured and detached, even when discussing deeply personal subjects. This lack of emotional coloration made his speech feel distant, not deceptive but oddly flat. Again, this is not what emotional suppression looks like. Suppression creates tension in speech. It creates strain. Detachment creates neutrality. Scott Peterson's baseline felt neutral. This neutrality extended beyond speech into posture and presence. He did not fidget excessively. He did not display restless movement. His body did not appear primed for emotional discharge. Instead, his posture suggested containment, not tension. Containment without tension is rare under prolonged stress, and it strongly suggests emotional disengagement rather than emotional control. Another key aspect of baseline analysis is context switching. When people move between environments, home, public, police, court, their emotional presentation usually shifts. Different pressures provoke different reactions. Scott Peterson's emotional presentation did not shift significantly across contexts. Whether addressing the media or interacting with law enforcement, his demeanor remained similar. This consistency undermines the idea of performance. Performance requires adaptation. Structure does not. It is also important to note what Scott Peterson did not display. He did not show sustained fear of judgment. He did not show visible anxiety about perception. He did not appear emotionally affected by public reaction. Emotionally engaged individuals are deeply influenced by how they are seen. Social evaluation triggers emotional responses, shame, anger, anxiety. Scott Peterson appeared largely insulated from this. This insulation aligns with emotional detachment. When emotional attachment to others is limited, social judgment carries less emotional weight. Criticism feels abstract. Suspicion feels distant. Condemnation feels external. This does not mean the individual is unaware. It means they are unaffected. This emotional insulation can be deeply misleading to observers, because we often interpret calm under accusation as confidence. But confidence is emotionally energized. Detachment is not. Scott Peterson did not appear energized. He appeared unmoved. This distinction is subtle but critical. Confidence seeks validation. Detachment avoids engagement. Scott Peterson did not attempt to emotionally correct perceptions. He did not escalate emotion to counter suspicion. He remained steady. This steadiness became disturbing because it did not align with the situation. The The emotional gravity of a missing pregnant wife typically overwhelms baseline behavior. But Scott Peterson's baseline appeared unchanged. This suggests that the emotional bond may not have been as deeply rooted as expected. Again, this does not prove intent. It reveals structure. Baseline analysis does not tell us what someone did. It tells us how they experienced the world. And Scott Peterson's emotional baseline suggests a world experienced at a distance. A world processed cognitively rather than emotionally. A world where emotion does not surge, even when it should. This becomes especially important as we move forward, because baseline behavior shapes everything that follows. It shapes how someone lies. It shapes how they plan. It shapes how they respond to consequences. An emotionally detached baseline does not crack under pressure. It persists. And persistence is what made Scott Peterson so difficult to read and so unsettling to watch. This chapter marks the transition of the documentary. We're no longer asking whether Scott Peterson's emotional response was unusual. We are recognizing that it was consistent. And consistency suggests identity, not circumstance. As we move deeper into his relationships and decisions, this emotional baseline will continue to appear, quietly shaping behavior without ever announcing itself. Because the most dangerous thing about emotional detachment is not what it does loudly, it is what it does silently. And Scott Peterson's silence was never temporary. It was foundational. On the surface, Scott and Laci Peterson looked like a couple many people admired. They were young. They were financially stable. They appeared affectionate in public. They were preparing for the birth of their first child. To friends and acquaintances, the marriage seemed functional, even ideal. But psychological depth is not measured by appearance. It is measured by emotional gravity. Emotional gravity is what makes a relationship feel anchoring. It is the invisible force that pulls people back toward one another during stress, conflict, and uncertainty. It is what makes loss feel devastating rather than inconvenient. And when emotional gravity is missing, a relationship can exist without ever truly binding the people inside it. This is the kind of marriage that looks intact from the outside but feels hollow from within. For emotionally detached individuals, marriage does not necessarily function as an emotional bond. Instead, it operates as a structure, a stable arrangement that provides routine, social legitimacy, and predictability. The relationship exists. The roles are filled, but emotional integration remains shallow. This does not mean the relationship is hostile. In fact, these marriages often appear calm. There may be few arguments, few dramatic conflicts, few visible emotional breakdowns, but there are also few moments of deep vulnerability, emotional intensity, or shared emotional dependence. For someone with an emotionally detached structure, this can feel comfortable. Low emotional demand means low emotional exposure. But comfort should not be confused with connection. In emotionally engaged marriages, partners influence one another's internal worlds. Their moods affect each other. Their fears intertwine. Their identities begin to overlap. In emotionally detached marriages, this overlap never fully forms. Each person remains internally separate. Scott Peterson's marriage to Laci appeared to function within this framework. There is little evidence of emotional volatility, deep conflict, or dramatic rupture prior to her disappearance. But there's also little evidence of emotional fusion, the kind of bond that reshapes priorities and internal life. This distinction matters because emotional detachment does not produce chaos. It produces neutrality, and neutrality can masquerade as stability. Another key feature of emotionally shallow marriages is compartmentalization. The relationship occupies one mental space. Work occupies another. Personal desires occupy another. Emotional spillover between these spaces is minimal. For emotionally engaged individuals, these compartments leak. Stress at work affects home life. Relationship conflict spills into other areas. Emotion is portable. For emotionally detached individuals, compartments remain sealed. This allows the marriage to exist without dominating emotional life. Scott Peterson's behavior suggests this kind of compartmentalization. The marriage existed, but it did not appear to exert strong emotional gravity over his internal world. This becomes especially relevant when we consider impending change. Pregnancy alters the emotional structure of a relationship. A child introduces permanence. Responsibility intensifies. Emotional demand increases. For emotionally engaged individuals, this often deepens attachment. The future feels more real. The bond strengthens. For emotionally detached individuals, the same change can feel intrusive. The relationship is no longer static. It demands emotional presence. It reduces internal autonomy. This shift can destabilize a marriage that relied on emotional neutrality to function. Because the system that worked before low emotional demand, predictable roles, minimal vulnerability no longer holds. The future becomes unavoidable. And for someone who prefers internal distance, unavoidable emotional futures can feel suffocating rather than meaningful. This does not require conscious resentment. It requires emotional mismatch. Scott Peterson's marriage may not have been failing in a dramatic sense, but it may have been reaching a point where emotional avoidance was no longer sustainable. Another important aspect of emotionally detached marriages is how partners are perceived. Emotionally engaged individuals often experience their partner as an extension of themselves. Their partner's pain feels personal. Their partner's fear feels shared. Emotionally detached individuals experience their partner as separate, close, but not fused. Loss, in this context, does not shatter identity. It disrupts routine. This distinction is deeply uncomfortable to consider because it challenges our belief that marriage automatically produces emotional depth. But psychology tells us otherwise. Marriage is a structure. Attachment is a process, and the two do not always align. Scott Peterson's emotional baseline suggests that attachment may not have fully formed, or may have remained shallow. This does not mean he disliked Laci. It means she may not have occupied his internal emotional center. This difference is subtle but profound. When emotional gravity is weak, the relationship does not function as a moral anchor. It does not exert the same restraining force over behavior. Emotionally engaged partners often describe feeling unable to imagine life without their spouse, not because of logic, but because of emotional dependence. Emotionally detached individuals do not experience this inability. They can imagine alternate futures without emotional collapse. This ability is not strength. It is distance. Distance allows possibilities to exist without emotional resistance. This becomes even more significant when we consider how emotionally detached individuals respond to dissatisfaction. Rather than confronting or processing emotional conflict, they often disengage. They do not argue intensely. They do not seek emotional resolution. They withdraw. Withdrawal can take many forms: physical distance, emotional distance, mental distance, and sometimes parallel emotional lives. This sets the stage for behaviors that appear shocking to emotionally engaged observers, but feel manageable to the detached individual, because the emotional cost is low. Scott Peterson's marriage, when viewed through this lens, appears less like a dramatic love story and more like a stable arrangement with limited emotional depth. Stable but fragile. Functional but unanchored. This fragility is not visible in daily life. It only becomes apparent when emotional demand increases beyond what the structure can tolerate. Pregnancy, responsibility, and future commitment push emotional systems into territory they cannot avoid. For emotionally engaged individuals, this pressure deepens connection. For emotionally detached individuals, it exposes limitation. This is why emotionally detached marriages often appear intact until suddenly they are not. There is no gradual unraveling. There is a quiet disengagement that goes unnoticed until consequences arrive. Scott Peterson's marriage may have existed in this quiet space, outwardly stable, inwardly distant. And when emotional gravity is missing, the relationship does not serve as a psychological restraint. It becomes a role, a structure, something to manage, not something that defines the self. This understanding does not determine guilt, but it reframes expectation. It explains how a marriage can exist without producing the emotional devastation we expect when it is threatened or lost. It explains why Scott Peterson's emotional baseline did not shift dramatically in response to his wife's disappearance. And it prepares us for what comes next. Because a marriage without emotional gravity does not collapse loudly. It fades quietly. And when emotional detachment intersects with responsibility, the consequences can be profound, not because of hatred, but because of absence. As we move forward, we will see how this emotional distance extends beyond marriage into other relationships, and how compartmentalization becomes not just a coping strategy, but a defining feature of Scott Peterson's psychological world. One of the most unsettling aspects of Scott Peterson's behavior was not simply that he had an affair. It was how easily that affair appeared to exist alongside his marriage, without visible emotional conflict. For most people, maintaining parallel romantic lives produces strain. Guilt surfaces, anxiety builds, emotional leakage becomes unavoidable. Lies multiply, and the psychological cost accumulates quickly. But Scott Peterson did not appear strained. There was no visible panic, no emotional confusion, no sense of internal collapse. Instead, he moved between two worlds with remarkable calm. To understand how this is possible, we need to look at compartmentalization, not as a tactic, but as a psychological structure. Compartmentalization is the ability to separate parts of one's life into distinct mental spaces that do not emotionally interact. Thoughts, emotions, and responsibilities remain sealed within their assigned compartments. For emotionally engaged individuals, compartments leak. Stress in one area spills into another. Guilt follows behavior. Emotional conflict demands resolution. For emotionally detached individuals, compartments remain closed. Each world exists independently. This ability is not necessarily manipulative. It does not require calculation or planning. It develops naturally in individuals whose emotional system does not integrate experiences deeply. Scott Peterson's affair with Amber Fry appears to have existed in such a compartment. Within that space, he could adopt a different narrative, different expectations, and a different imagined future, without emotionally confronting the contradictions. This is why his behavior did not show the classic signs of inner turmoil. There was no visible oscillation between guilt and desire, no emotional instability, no behavioral inconsistency driven by stress. Instead, his demeanor remained consistent across contexts. This consistency is not what emotional conflict looks like. It is what emotional separation looks like. For emotionally detached individuals, compartmentalization reduces emotional friction. Each part of life is experienced in isolation, minimizing emotional overload. This creates an illusion of control, not over others, but over internal experience. Rather than being torn between competing emotional demands, the individual simply moves between contexts. Scott Peterson did not appear emotionally torn. He appeared emotionally unburdened. This is deeply disturbing to emotionally engaged observers because it violates a core assumption that caring deeply makes deception difficult. But if emotional attachment is weak, deception carries little internal cost. The lie does not clash with feeling. It simply exists. Another important element of compartmentalization is future orientation. Emotionally detached individuals often live mentally ahead of their current circumstances. They imagine alternate futures, rehearse new identities, and construct narratives that feel more comfortable than present reality. In Scott Peterson's case, the affair allowed him to inhabit a future that did not include emotional weight, responsibility, or constraint. This was not fantasy in the sense of delusion. It was psychological escape. The future imagined within that compartment did not emotionally collide with the present. For most people, imagining a future without their spouse triggers guilt, fear, or sadness. For emotionally detached individuals, it does not. because imagination is not tethered to emotional consequence. This detachment makes it easier to maintain contradictory realities without distress. It also explains why Scott Peterson's behavior did not show emotional urgency. There was no pressure to resolve the conflict, because the conflict did not register emotionally. The compartments did not interact. This does not mean Scott Peterson did not understand the contradiction. It means he did not feel it. Understanding and feeling are not the same. This distinction is critical. People often assume that deception must involve emotional strain. But strain arises when emotion demands coherence. When emotion is weak or absent, coherence is unnecessary. Each narrative can exist independently. This is why Scott Peterson could speak calmly about his marriage while simultaneously investing in an affair. There was no emotional collision to manage. Another unsettling aspect of compartmentalization is how it affects responsibility. Emotionally engaged individuals experience responsibility as emotional weight. The thought of harm or loss generates distress. Emotionally detached individuals experience responsibility cognitively. They understand obligations intellectually, but do not feel compelled by them emotionally. This weakens internal restraint. When emotional attachment does not bind behavior, choices become easier to execute. Again, this does not create violence, but it removes emotional barriers that typically prevent it. This is why compartmentalization becomes dangerous when paired with moral decisions. Because without emotional integration, behavior is governed by convenience rather than consequence. Scott Peterson's affair illustrates this pattern clearly. There was no visible urgency to reconcile his worlds. No sign of emotional collapse as contradictions mounted. Instead, his behavior remained steady. This steadiness is not evidence of confidence or intelligence. It is evidence of emotional separation. Another critical feature of compartmentalization is its invisibility. From the outside, nothing appears wrong. There are no dramatic mood swings, no visible guilt, no emotional fallout. The person appears calm, controlled, even normal. This makes detection difficult. And when consequences arrive, observers are often shocked, not because the behavior is impossible, but because the emotional absence makes it feel incomprehensible. Scott Peterson's ability to maintain parallel lives without visible distress contributed significantly to the public perception of him as cold or calculating. But calculation implies intent. Compartmentalization does not require intent. It is automatic, it is structural, and once established, it becomes the default way of navigating emotional complexity. This explains why Scott Peterson did not appear emotionally overwhelmed as the affair became public. For emotionally engaged individuals, exposure triggers panic. For emotionally detached individuals, exposure triggers recalibration, not emotional collapse. The system adapts by closing off emotional engagement even further. This is why emotional detachment often deepens under stress rather than breaking down. It is not fragile. It is rigid. This rigidity is what makes compartmentalization so unsettling, because it allows individuals to move through morally complex situations without visible emotional consequence. They are not driven by desire or rage. They are driven by disengagement, and disengagement is harder to confront. This chapter does not exist to judge the affair itself. It exists to explain how such an affair could coexist with apparent emotional calm. It shows us that Scott Peterson's behavior was not chaotic or impulsive. It was consistent with a psychological structure that separates life into sealed compartments, each operating without emotional interference. As we move forward, this compartmentalization will become even more important, because the same structure that allows an affair to exist without distress also allows lies to exist without anxiety. And when lies carry no emotional cost, they become easy. That is where this story goes next. By the time Scott Peterson's behavior became the subject of public scrutiny, many people were already convinced that something about him felt wrong. But what often gets lost in hindsight is this. Scott Peterson did not suddenly become emotionally distant after Laci disappeared. The emotional silence people noticed during the investigation was not new. It was simply exposed. One of the most important questions in psychological analysis is whether a behavior appears only under stress or whether it appears consistently across contexts and time. Stress can distort behavior. Fear can alter presentation. Pressure can temporarily change personality. But traits persist. And when we examine Scott Peterson across different stages of life, social settings, friendships, work environments, romantic relationships, the same emotional pattern appears again and again. Quiet, reserved, emotionally muted. People who knew Scott before the crime did not describe him as volatile, expressive, or emotionally intense. He was not known for emotional outbursts. He was not described as someone who shared deeply personal feelings or sought emotional connection through vulnerability. Instead, descriptions tend to orbit the same center. Calm, controlled, private, hard to read. These descriptors are not inherently negative. In many environments, they are rewarded. Emotional restraint is often mistaken for maturity. Privacy is mistaken for depth. Calmness is mistaken for reliability. This is how emotionally detached individuals often move through life without drawing attention. They do not disrupt systems. They adapt to them. Scott Peterson appeared to function well in environments that required composure. He was able to socialize, maintain appearances, and navigate expectations without emotional friction. But functioning is not the same as connecting. Connection requires emotional reciprocity, the ability to resonate with others' feelings, to share emotional space, to be affected. Scott Peterson did not appear to engage at this level. This becomes clearer when we look at how emotional moments were handled. Emotionally expressive individuals tend to mark important life events emotionally. They remember how moments felt. They reference emotional states. They attach meaning through feeling. Emotionally detached individuals often remember events factually. What happened, where it occurred, what was said, but not how it felt. This distinction is subtle but revealing. In interviews and conversations, Scott Peterson's emotional language remained sparse. He did not describe feelings with depth or variation. Emotional vocabulary was limited. Affect remained flat. Again, this does not mean he was lying. It means emotion was not central to his internal experience. Another indicator of emotional silence is how a person responds to other people's emotion. Emotionally engaged individuals mirror emotion instinctively. When someone else is distressed, they respond with visible empathy, changes in tone, posture, facial expression. Emotionally detached individuals do not mirror as strongly. They may acknowledge distress intellectually without emotionally synchronizing with it. Scott Peterson did not display strong emotional mirroring. When others expressed concern, fear, or urgency, his emotional state did not visibly align. This lack of emotional synchronization made interactions feel one-sided. People felt they were reacting alone. This is deeply unsettling in emotionally charged situations, because shared emotion is how humans co-regulate stress. When one person remains emotionally still while others are activated, imbalance forms. An imbalance breeds suspicion. Importantly, emotional silence is not the same as emotional repression. Repression implies something is being pushed down. Silence implies there is little noise to begin with. Scott Peterson did not appear to struggle with emotion. He appeared unaffected by it. This difference is crucial. Another hallmark of emotional silence is absence of emotional escalation. Emotionally engaged people escalate emotionally as circumstances worsen. Their reactions intensify. Scott Peterson's emotional response did not intensify. As the investigation deepened, as public attention increased, as suspicion mounted, his emotional presentation stayed within the same narrow range. This is not typical stress behavior. Stress usually amplifies emotion, unless emotion is already muted. Emotional silence also affects how people experience time. Emotionally engaged individuals feel time differently during crisis. Time stretches. Moments feel heavy. Waiting becomes unbearable. Emotionally detached individuals experience time more evenly. Crisis does not warp perception as strongly. This may explain why Scott Peterson appeared able to wait, calmly, patiently, without visible distress. Waiting did not torture him emotionally. It simply occurred. Another important factor is lack of emotional aftermath. After emotionally intense events, most people experience emotional residue, exhaustion, sadness, irritability, numbness. Scott Peterson did not show clear emotional aftermath. He did not appear emotionally depleted. He did not appear drained. This absence of emotional residue suggests that emotional engagement was minimal. You cannot be emotionally exhausted by feelings you never fully experienced. This emotional silence extended into public perception. People watching Scott Peterson did not feel emotionally connected to him. They did not feel drawn into his experience. Instead, they felt shut out. This lack of emotional access created distance, and distance created distrust. Humans are deeply uncomfortable with emotional opacity. We prefer people who are readable, even if we dislike what we see. Unreadable people make us uneasy. Scott Peterson was unreadable, and unreadability is often interpreted as concealment. But concealment requires intent. Unreadability can simply be a byproduct of emotional silence. This silence also explains why Scott Peterson did not appear to seek emotional validation. He did not attempt to persuade through emotion. He did not try to evoke sympathy. Emotionally engaged individuals instinctively seek emotional alignment under threat. Scott Peterson did not. He did not escalate emotion to repair perception. This suggests emotional detachment rather than strategic restraint. Strategy seeks outcome. Detachment avoids engagement. Scott Peterson avoided emotional engagement entirely. This pattern becomes undeniable when viewed cumulatively. One instance of emotional flatness can be explained away. A lifetime of it cannot. The emotional silence people saw during the investigation was not a mask slipping. It was the absence of a mask. There was nothing beneath to reveal. This is why Scott Peterson felt disturbing rather than dramatic. He did not perform evil. He did not perform grief. He did not perform fear. He performed nothing. And nothing is harder to interpret than something. This chapter matters because it confirms something essential. Scott Peterson's emotional absence was not situational. It was not stress-induced. It was not temporary. It was consistent. And consistency tells us we are not looking at reaction. We're looking at structure. As we move forward, this structure will explain something even more unsettling. Because emotional silence does not just affect relationships. It affects truth. When emotion is muted, lies do not hurt. When lies do not hurt, they do not trigger anxiety. And when anxiety is absent, deception becomes disturbingly easy. That is where this story goes next. When people hear the word control, they often imagine something loud. They imagine anger. They imagine intimidation. They imagine raised voices, threats, or physical presence. But not all control announces itself. Some forms of control are quiet. They do not rely on force. They do not rely on fear. They rely on absence. Scott Peterson did not exert control through domination. He exerted it through emotional withdrawal. This distinction is critical because control without dominance often goes unnoticed, even by those closest to it. In emotionally engaged relationships, power dynamics are visible. Conflict creates friction. Anger reveals tension. Control becomes something to push against. In emotionally detached relationships, control operates differently. There is nothing to push against. The emotionally detached individual does not argue. They do not escalate. They do not demand. Instead, they disengage. And disengagement quietly shifts power. When one person withdraws emotionally, the other is forced to compensate. They explain more. They reassure more. They attempt to repair connection. The emotionally detached person does nothing. And in doing nothing, they dictate the emotional climate. Scott Peterson's behavior aligns with this pattern. There is little evidence of overt dominance in his interactions. He was not described as controlling through anger or aggression. He did not appear to intimidate through emotional volatility. Instead, he remained neutral. And neutrality can be deeply controlling, because neutrality removes feedback. When someone does not react emotionally, others struggle to locate where they stand. They cannot tell if they are hurting, pleasing, or reaching the other person. This uncertainty creates imbalance. Emotionally engaged individuals are uncomfortable with emotional ambiguity. They seek clarity, connection, and response. Emotionally detached individuals provide none of these. This forces the emotionally engaged partner to do the emotional labor. They adapt, they accommodate, they adjust expectations. Over time, the relationship bends around the emotionally detached individual's limits. Not because those limits are enforced, but because they are immovable. This is control without force. Scott Peterson's emotional baseline, calm, distant, unreactive, created a fixed center around which others had to orbit. His lack of emotional engagement meant that conflicts did not escalate, but it also meant they did not resolve. Issues simply dissipated without ever being processed. This creates a false sense of harmony. From the outside, the relationship looks peaceful. From the inside, emotional needs quietly go unmet. This kind of control is difficult to name because it does not feel aggressive. It feels like absence, and absence is hard to confront. You cannot argue with silence. You cannot negotiate with indifference. You cannot resolve what never surfaces. This is why emotionally detached control is often more destabilizing than overt dominance. Dominance triggers resistance. Detachment triggers accommodation. Over time, the emotionally engaged person becomes the one carrying emotional responsibility for the relationship. They anticipate, they soften, they minimize their own needs. Not because they are told to, but because there is no response on the other side. Scott Peterson's demeanor suggests this dynamic. He did not appear to emotionally pursue reassurance, validation, or connection. He remained self-contained. This self-containment subtly dictates terms. The relationship proceeds on his emotional bandwidth, not because he demands it, but because it cannot expand. This kind of control often goes unrecognized because it does not feel malicious. It feels passive, but passivity can shape outcomes just as powerfully as action. Another critical aspect of control without dominance is emotional non-reactivity. Emotionally engaged individuals react to disappointment, frustration, or conflict. Emotionally detached individuals often do not. This lack of reaction can shut down discussion entirely. When one person does not respond emotionally, the other eventually stops trying. Communication becomes logistical rather than emotional. The relationship continues, but without depth. This dynamic can be especially powerful during major life changes. Pregnancy, responsibility, and future planning demand emotional engagement. When one partner remains emotionally distant, the other must carry the emotional weight alone. This creates imbalance. An imbalance creates quiet resentment, often unspoken, often unresolved. Scott Peterson's emotional detachment meant that he was not pulled into emotional negotiation. He did not appear to emotionally wrestle with decisions. He did not appear emotionally conflicted. This gave him internal freedom. Not freedom in the sense of empowerment, but freedom from emotional obligation. This freedom can be mistaken for strength, but it is actually insulation. Another unsettling aspect of control without dominance is how it affects truth. Emotionally engaged individuals experience lying as emotionally stressful. Guilt surfaces. Anxiety appears. Emotional consequences demand resolution. Emotionally detached individuals experience lying cognitively. They know it is wrong. They know it has consequences, but they do not feel compelled to resolve it emotionally. This reduces internal resistance. Scott Peterson's emotional silence suggests that lying did not produce visible distress. Not because he was skilled at deception, but because deception did not clash with emotional attachment. When emotional investment is low, emotional cost is low. This makes control easier to maintain, not through fear, but through disengagement. Another feature of this dynamic is predictability. Emotionally detached individuals are predictable precisely because they do not emotionally react. They do not surprise others with outbursts or breakdowns. They remain steady. This steadiness can create a sense of reliability. But reliability without emotional engagement is hollow. It provides structure without safety. And when something goes wrong, there is no emotional net. Scott Peterson's calmness created predictability. People could anticipate his tone, his demeanor, his lack of reaction. But predictability did not equate to trust. Over time, predictability without emotional access feels cold, because it offers no reassurance. This is why emotionally detached control often becomes visible only in retrospect. While the relationship is functioning, the absence is normalized. When crisis hits, the absence becomes undeniable. Scott Peterson's emotional disengagement did not escalate under pressure. He did not respond emotionally to fear, judgment, or loss. This reinforced the perception that he was in control. But control, in this case, did not come from dominance. It came from detachment. He was not managing others. He was managing distance. And distance creates power by default, because those who care more are always more vulnerable. This is not a conscious strategy. It is a psychological reality. The person who needs less emotional connection holds more control over the emotional environment. Scott Peterson appeared to need very little. This needlessness shaped interactions. It shaped perception, and it shaped how others responded to him. As the investigation unfolded, this dynamic persisted. He did not emotionally chase understanding. He did not plead emotionally. He did not escalate emotion to regain trust. This lack of emotional pursuit reinforced the perception of control. But again, control here was not assertive. It was passive. And passive control is difficult to confront because it leaves no clear point of resistance. This chapter matters because it dismantles a common misunderstanding. Scott Peterson did not need to dominate emotionally to maintain control. He simply needed to remain disengaged, and disengagement did the rest. As we move forward, this dynamic will become even more significant because control without dominance does not collapse under pressure. It does not provoke confrontation. It simply persists. And when consequences arrive, it offers no emotional warning. That is why this form of control is so unsettling. It operates quietly. It leaves little evidence. And it is often mistaken for composure until it is too late. Long before juries deliberate, verdicts begin forming elsewhere. They form in the human mind, quietly, instinctively, and often without awareness. In Scott Peterson's case, many people reached an emotional conclusion long before they reached a factual one. They did not analyze evidence first. They analyzed him, and what they saw did not match what they expected to see. This is where emotional detachment becomes dangerous, not because it proves guilt, but because it mimics it. Human beings are not wired to judge wrongdoing purely through logic. We rely on emotional signals to assess sincerity, remorse, fear, and attachment. These signals act as shortcuts, helping us decide who feels safe and who does not. When someone behaves normally after tragedy, we relax. When they don't, suspicion takes over. Scott Peterson did not display the emotional signals people expect from an innocent man in crisis. He did not appear desperate. He did not appear emotionally shattered. He did not appear consumed by fear or grief. Instead, he appeared calm, and calmness, in this context, felt wrong. This reaction is not unique to Scott Peterson. Across cultures and history, emotional expression has been treated as evidence of innocence. Tears signal loss. Panic signals fear of consequence. Emotional collapse signals humanity. When these signals are missing, people assume something is being hidden. This assumption feels logical, but it is psychological, not evidentiary. We confuse emotional conformity with truthfulness. This confusion lies at the heart of why detachment looks like guilt. Emotionally expressive people appear sincere because their internal state matches our expectations. Emotionally detached people violate those expectations, even when they're telling the truth. Scott Peterson's emotional baseline violated expectations from the beginning. And once expectations are violated, interpretation shifts. Neutral behavior is no longer neutral. It becomes suspicious. Another reason detachment looks like guilt is because guilt itself is often imagined as a hidden emotion. People assume that guilt exists internally and must therefore be concealed. When someone does not appear distressed, observers conclude that distress is being suppressed. But this assumes distress exists. If emotional attachment is weak, guilt may not arise in the way observers expect. Not because the person does not understand right and wrong, but because emotion does not govern moral experience as strongly. This distinction is uncomfortable because it challenges the belief that morality is always emotionally felt. Scott Peterson may have understood the moral weight of the situation cognitively, without experiencing emotional turbulence. To emotionally engaged observers, this looks impossible. And when something feels impossible, people reject it. They substitute a more familiar explanation: deception. Another powerful reason detachment looks like guilt is emotional asymmetry. In high-profile cases, everyone else is emotionally activated. The victim's family is grieving. The public is outraged. The media is urgent. Emotion fills the environment. When one person remains emotionally flat within that environment, the contrast is jarring. Scott Peterson's calmness did not exist in a vacuum. It existed alongside intense collective emotion. This imbalance magnified suspicion. Emotionally, it felt like he was standing still while the world burned around him. This does not prove guilt, but psychologically it feels wrong. Humans expect emotional alignment during shared tragedy. When alignment does not occur, we interpret it as refusal, not inability. We assume the person won't feel rather than can't feel deeply. This assumption hardens quickly. Another reason detachment resembles guilt is that guilt is often imagined as something that leaks. People expect liars to show stress. They look for nervousness, hesitation, contradiction. But emotionally detached individuals do not leak emotion easily. They remain steady. This steadiness, paradoxically, is interpreted as composure, the calm of someone who knows more than they are saying. Scott Peterson's consistency was interpreted as confidence. But confidence is emotionally energized. Detachment is not. Observers mistake emotional flatness for emotional control. They assume the person is holding it together. But holding something together requires tension. Scott Peterson showed little tension. That absence of strain suggested to many that he was hiding something successfully. But again, this assumes something was being hidden. It does not consider the possibility that emotional engagement was simply low. This misinterpretation is common. Emotionally detached people are often accused of being cold, manipulative, or deceptive, not because of what they do, but because of what they do not display. They do not reassure emotionally. They do not mirror distress. They do not perform grief. And performance is what people look for. Another important factor is moral storytelling. We expect wrongdoing to follow a narrative arc. Motive, emotion, conflict, collapse. When someone does not follow that arc, we feel unsettled. Scott Peterson did not appear conflicted. He did not appear torn. He did not appear emotionally burdened. This lack of visible conflict suggested to observers that the conflict had already been resolved, that he had made peace with something terrible. That interpretation may or may not be accurate, but it is psychologically predictable. Humans distrust people who do not appear to struggle. Struggle reassures us that conscience is active. When struggle is absent, we assume conscience is absent too. This is a dangerous assumption, because conscience does not always announce itself emotionally. Another reason detachment looks like guilt is because of our relationship with fear. Innocent people are expected to fear false accusation. They are expected to panic. They're expected to fight emotionally. Scott Peterson did not appear frightened by suspicion. This was interpreted as arrogance or confidence. But fear requires emotional sensitivity. Emotionally detached individuals may understand risk without emotionally reacting to it. Fear does not search. It registers quietly. This quiet registration feels unnatural to emotionally engaged observers. And again, the default explanation becomes guilt. It is important to recognize that these interpretations happen automatically. People do not choose to suspect. Their nervous systems do. Emotionally, Scott Peterson did not fit. And when someone does not fit, the mind fills in the gap. This does not mean the public was malicious. It means they were human. This chapter matters because it explains how emotional detachment can condemn someone socially before evidence ever does. It shows how psychological mismatch becomes moral judgment, and it highlights a terrifying reality. That innocence is not just about facts. It is about emotional performance. When someone fails to perform emotion in the expected way, they lose credibility, even if they are telling the truth. Scott Peterson's emotional structure placed him at a severe disadvantage in the court of public perception, not because of what he did, but because of how he felt or appeared not to feel. This does not determine guilt or innocence, but it explains why suspicion hardens so quickly, why empathy vanished early, and why the emotional verdict arrived long before the legal one. As we move forward, this misunderstanding will become even more consequential. Because once detachment is equated with guilt, every behavior is interpreted through that lens. Silence becomes concealment. Calm becomes calculation. Distance becomes danger. This is where emotional absence stops being neutral and starts becoming evidence, whether it should or not. There is a moment in every investigation when time itself becomes a psychological force. In the early stages, uncertainty dominates. People speculate. They wait. They hope. Emotion moves in waves: fear, optimism, panic, denial. But as time passes, something else happens. Emotion begins to decay. Hope narrows. Patience thins. The future closes in. For most people, prolonged uncertainty amplifies emotional distress. Anxiety grows heavier. The nervous system remains activated. The body struggles to maintain equilibrium. Time presses down. But Scott Peterson did not appear to experience time this way. As days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, his emotional presentation remained strikingly unchanged. This is where emotional detachment reveals one of its most unsettling properties. It does not erode under time. It does not accumulate pressure. It does not decay. Emotionally engaged individuals experience time as weight. The longer uncertainty lasts, the heavier it becomes. Their behavior changes. Their effect shifts. Their internal world shows signs of strain. Scott Peterson's did not. This absence of emotional decay is critical, because time is the ultimate stressor. If emotional control were being exerted, time would weaken it. But if emotional absence were structural, time would change nothing. And nothing changed. As the investigation progressed, Scott Peterson did not appear increasingly desperate. He did not escalate emotionally. He did not show signs of psychological exhaustion. This does not mean he was unaffected by events. It means emotion was not governing his experience. This distinction matters because it reframes how we understand the concept of pressure. Pressure does not act equally on all psychological systems. For emotionally engaged individuals, pressure destabilizes. For emotionally detached individuals, pressure often leads to further withdrawal, not breakdown. Scott Peterson's emotional baseline did not collapse under prolonged uncertainty. It flattened. This flattening is often mistaken for resolve or confidence. But resolve is emotionally energized. Flattening is not. Flattening suggests emotional disengagement, a retreat into neutrality as a coping mechanism. Another important aspect of time is anticipation. Emotionally engaged individuals are tormented by anticipation. Waiting becomes unbearable. The unknown creates constant emotional activation. Emotionally detached individuals experience anticipation cognitively. They understand uncertainty without emotionally inhabiting it. This may explain why Scott Peterson appeared capable of waiting without visible distress. Waiting did not torture him emotionally. It simply existed. This ability to coexist with uncertainty without emotional agitation is deeply unsettling to observers. Because we expect fear to rise. When it does not, we assume certainty. And certainty, in this context, looks like guilt. But certainty can also be detachment. Another critical feature of the emotional void before the fall is absence of emotional tipping points. Emotionally engaged individuals experience moments where emotional pressure becomes unbearable, points of collapse, confession, or visible deterioration. Scott Peterson did not appear to reach such a point. There was no visible breaking moment, no emotional confession, no psychological implosion. This absence challenges our understanding of accountability. We expect guilt to break people. We expect fear to crack them. We expect conscience to force its way to the surface. But those expectations assume emotional intensity exists to begin with. If emotional intensity is weak, there is nothing to force upward. This creates a chilling possibility that a person can move toward catastrophic consequences without experiencing emotional resistance. Not because they are driven by rage or hatred, but because they are moving through an emotional void. This void is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It simply removes friction. As consequences approach, emotionally engaged individuals feel dread. Emotionally detached individuals process consequence abstractly. They know what is coming. They do not feel it. This gap between knowing and feeling is where collapse is expected, but does not arrive. Scott Peterson's behavior suggests that emotional collapse was not part of his psychological trajectory. There was no emotional crescendo, no climactic breakdown, only continuation. Another unsettling feature of this emotional void is lack of emotional anticipation of loss. Emotionally engaged individuals imagine loss and feel its weight before it occurs. Emotionally detached individuals can imagine loss without emotional rehearsal. This means that when loss arrives, it does not shock the system. It simply occurs. This may help explain why Scott Peterson did not display visible devastation even as reality closed in. The emotional future may not have felt real enough to grieve. This does not require denial. It requires detachment. Time also reveals patterns of emotional preservation. Emotionally engaged individuals often deteriorate emotionally over prolonged stress. Sleep suffers. Mood shifts. Irritability increases. Scott Peterson did not display obvious signs of emotional deterioration. His effect remained narrow. His demeanor remained steady. This stability is often interpreted as strength. But strength under prolonged stress usually requires emotional regulation. Regulation implies something is being managed. Scott Peterson's stability suggests there was little to manage. This is why the emotional void is so unsettling. It does not feel like control. It feels like absence. And absence resists time. This chapter matters because it shows that Scott Peterson's emotional detachment did not weaken as consequences approached. It remained intact, which forces us to confront a deeply uncomfortable reality, that some people move toward irreversible outcomes without emotional escalation, not because they are fearless, but because they are disconnected. This emotional void is not unique to this case, but in this case, it became visible under extreme scrutiny, and visibility made it frightening. As time passed, the public waited for an emotional moment that never arrived. No tearful confession, no visible collapse, no emotional reckoning. The absence of these moments intensified suspicion, because we rely on emotional breakdowns as proof of humanity. When humanity does not perform, we question whether it exists. This does not mean Scott Peterson lacked humanity. It means his humanity may not have expressed itself emotionally. And that possibility terrifies us, because it suggests that emotional safeguards we rely on are not universal. As we approach the later stages of this story, this emotional void becomes increasingly consequential. Because when consequences finally arrive, arrest, trial, sentencing, emotional detachment does not suddenly disappear. It persists. And persistence under consequence is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of all. This chapter marks the threshold, the point where emotional absence stops being observational and starts colliding with irreversible outcomes. The fall does not arrive with chaos. It arrives quietly, and in that quiet, emotional absence reveals its final truth. That not all collapses are emotional. Some are procedural, and some happen without anyone ever breaking. Prison is often described as a place where people finally confront themselves. Removed from distraction, stripped of routine, isolated from the outside world, inmates are forced to live with their thoughts. Time slows, silence stretches, consequence becomes unavoidable. For many, this environment changes everything. Emotionally expressive individuals often deteriorate in confinement. Anxiety intensifies, depression deepens, guilt surfaces, regret replays itself endlessly. The mind loops through memory, replaying moments that cannot be undone. Time becomes punishment, but time does not act equally on all psychological structures. For emotionally detached individuals, prison can function very differently. Instead of intensifying emotion, it can flatten it further. Instead of forcing confrontation, it can reinforce distance. Scott Peterson's post-conviction behavior suggests this second pattern. Years passed, then more years, and yet there was no widely observed emotional transformation. No dramatic reckoning, no visible psychological collapse, no clear emotional evolution. This absence is as important as any action, because time, in theory, should change a person. When it does not, we are forced to ask why. Emotionally engaged individuals experience time as accumulation. Feelings pile up, regret compounds, memory grows heavier. Emotionally detached individuals experience time as duration. Days pass, routines form, life narrows. Emotion does not compound. This difference is critical to understanding why prison did not appear to erode Scott Peterson emotionally. Prison removes stimulation. It removes novelty. It removes emotional input. For many people, this deprivation is unbearable. For emotionally detached individuals, it can feel oddly familiar. Their internal world has always been quieter. Their emotional bandwidth has always been narrow. Confinement does not introduce emotional deprivation. It mirrors it. This does not mean prison is easy. It means prison does not provoke emotional collapse in the way observers expect. Another key factor is identity preservation. Emotionally engaged individuals often experience identity rupture in prison. Their sense of self fractures under guilt, shame, and regret. Emotionally detached individuals tend to preserve identity through withdrawal. They retreat inward. They reduce emotional exposure further. Rather than confronting emotion, they avoid it entirely. This avoidance is not denial. It is insulation. Scott Peterson's emotional presentation after conviction did not suggest deep internal upheaval. There was no public indication of psychological disintegration, no clear evidence of emotional reckoning. Instead, there was continuation. This continuation is deeply unsettling to observers, because prison is supposed to change people. When it doesn't, we assume resistance. But resistance implies struggle. What if there is no struggle? Another reason prison does not necessarily transform emotionally detached individuals is low emotional dependency. Emotionally engaged individuals rely heavily on external relationships for emotional regulation. When those relationships are severed, emotional collapse often follows. Emotionally detached individuals do not rely on others in the same way. Their emotional life is already internal, minimal, and self-contained. Isolation does not shock the system. it reinforces it. This may explain why Scott Peterson did not display visible emotional deterioration over time. The environment did not attack his emotional structure. It aligned with it. Another unsettling element is the absence of emotional milestones. Emotionally engaged people experience anniversaries, reminders, and milestones as emotionally charged events. They relive loss. They experience waves of grief. Emotionally detached individuals do not mark time emotionally. Dates pass. Years pass. The emotional system remains flat. This does not mean memory disappears. It means memory does not carry emotional weight. Scott Peterson's behavior suggests that emotional memory did not intensify with time. There was no visible emotional decay. This challenges a deeply held belief that guilt grows heavier with time. For many people, it does. For emotionally detached individuals, it may not. Guilt requires emotional attachment to consequence. Without that attachment, guilt remains abstract, understood but not felt. This distinction is horrifying to emotionally engaged observers because it suggests that time alone does not guarantee moral reckoning. Another factor is routine dominance. Prison life is structured. Meals, counts, yard time, lockdown. Routine becomes the organizing force. For emotionally detached individuals, routine provides stability without emotional demand. It replaces the chaos of the outside world with predictability. This predictability can feel regulating. Emotionally engaged individuals suffer under monotony. Emotionally detached individuals adapt to it. Scott Peterson's apparent ability to exist within prison routine without visible emotional collapse suggests that routine replaced emotional processing. Life became procedural, and procedural life requires little emotional engagement. This does not mean he was unaffected by a situation. It means he did not process it emotionally. Another important consideration is lack of emotional audience. Much of emotional expression is social. We cry because someone sees us. We confess because someone listens. We break because someone witnesses. In prison, emotional audiences are limited. Emotionally detached individuals do not seek emotional witnesses. They do not need to be seen. This reduces emotional pressure further. Scott Peterson did not appear to seek emotional validation. He did not perform remorse. He did not perform suffering. This absence was interpreted by many as lack of remorse. But remorse, like guilt, requires emotional depth. Without emotional gravity, remorse does not surface visibly. This does not mean understanding is absent. It means feeling is. This chapter matters because it dismantles another comforting myth, that punishment naturally produces emotional transformation. It does not. Punishment produces consequence. Transformation requires emotional engagement. If emotional engagement is minimal, transformation may never occur. This is why Scott Peterson's continued emotional flatness in prison unsettles people. It violates the expectation that suffering will correct detachment. But detachment does not respond to suffering in predictable ways. It simply persists. As years passed, the public continued to wait for a moment. A breakdown, a confession, a visible change. That moment never arrived, and its absence became its own form of disturbance. Because we rely on emotional decay as proof that justice is working. When decay does not occur, justice feels incomplete. Scott Peterson's emotional consistency after conviction suggests that emotional absence was not situational. It was foundational. Prison did not create it. Time did not erode it. Consequence did not transform it. This realization forces us to confront a final, deeply uncomfortable truth. That some people can move through the most severe consequences imaginable without emotional collapse. Not because they are strong, but because they're disconnected. As we move into the final chapter, we must ask what this means for society, for justice, for how we interpret remorse, rehabilitation, and danger. Because if emotional absence does not decay with time, then time alone is not enough. And that realization changes how we understand not just this case, but human nature itself. Long after trials end and sentences are handed down, some cases refuse to settle. They linger. They return in documentaries, discussions, arguments, and late-night questions that never quite resolve. They resist closure, not because facts are missing, but because something deeper remains unsettled. The Scott Peterson case is one of those cases. And the reason it continues to haunt people is not only what happened to Laci Peterson. It is what Scott Peterson's emotional presence, or absence, forces us to confront about ourselves. Human beings rely on emotion to make sense of the world. We do not just use emotion to feel. We use it to judge. We decide who is safe, who is dangerous, who is sincere, and who is deceptive largely through emotional cues. Emotion is how we recognize one another. This is why cases like this disturb us so deeply. Because Scott Peterson did not offer emotional recognition. He did not mirror grief. He did not reflect fear. He did not resonate with collective loss. And without emotional resonance, the story felt incomplete. We want tragedy to come with visible emotional consequence. We want to see pain, remorse, or collapse. Not because we enjoy suffering, but because it reassures us that moral gravity exists. When someone appears untouched by devastation, it threatens a fundamental belief. That terrible acts must feel terrible to the person responsible. When that belief is challenged, we feel unsafe. This is why the case continues to provoke debate. Not because people disagree about evidence alone, but because they disagree about what emotional absence means. Some interpret it as proof of guilt. Some interpret it as evidence of pathology. Some interpret it as manipulation. And some cannot reconcile it all, because emotional absence creates a vacuum, and humans are uncomfortable with vacuums. We fill them with meaning. Another reason this case haunts us is because it disrupts the emotional narrative we rely on for closure. Most stories of wrongdoing follow a familiar arc. Conflict, emotional escalation, collapse, reckoning. This arc allows us to believe that conscience eventually asserts itself. Scott Peterson's story did not follow that arc. There was no visible emotional escalation, no public collapse, no cathartic reckoning. Instead, there was continuity, and continuity without emotion feels unfinished. This is why people continue to search for something, a confession, a breakdown, a moment of emotional truth. They are not searching for information. They are searching for emotional resolution, and that resolution never arrived. Another deeply unsettling aspect of this case is that it forces us to confront the limits of empathy. Empathy relies on shared emotional experience. We understand others by imagining how we would feel in their place. But when someone's emotional structure differs fundamentally from ours, empathy fails. We cannot imagine not feeling what we would feel. And when imagination fails, fear steps in. Scott Peterson's emotional distance made him difficult to empathize with, not because he was hostile, but because he was unreachable. This emotional unreachability felt threatening, because empathy is how we reassure ourselves that others are governed by the same moral forces we are. When empathy fails, moral predictability fails, and unpredictability frightens us. This is why emotionally detached individuals often become symbols of danger in public imagination, not because they act violently, but because we cannot read them. Unreadable people feel unsafe. Another reason this case lingers is because it exposes an uncomfortable truth about justice. Justice systems are built on evidence, procedure, and law, but public judgment is built on emotion. We want to believe those systems align. We want to believe that emotional intuition always tracks truth. But cases like this reveal a gap. They show us that emotional response and factual reality do not always align. And that realization is deeply unsettling, because it means our instincts, the tools we trust most, can mislead us. Scott Peterson's emotional detachment forced the public to rely on instinct first and evidence second. And once instinct settles, evidence struggles to dislodge it. This creates lasting tension. Even people who believe justice was served feel unsettled, because emotionally, something never resolved. Another reason this case continues to haunt us is because it confronts us with emotional inequality. We assume everyone feels loss, fear, and responsibility in roughly the same way. We assume emotional depth is universal. But this case suggests otherwise. It suggests that some people may experience the world with far less emotional gravity and still function normally within society. This possibility destabilizes our sense of safety because we rely on shared emotional experience as an invisible social contract. When that contract is broken, even quietly, we feel exposed. The Scott Peterson case forces us to ask, how many people live among us with emotional structures radically different from our own, and how would we recognize them? This question is disturbing precisely because there is no clear answer. Emotional absence does not announce itself. It does not come with warning signs. It blends in. Another reason this case persists is because it blurs the line between explanation and excuse. Psychological understanding is often mistaken for justification. But understanding emotional structure does not excuse behavior. It explains it. An explanation can feel threatening because it removes the comfort of simple narratives. People want villains who feel evil. They want rage, hatred, or cruelty. Scott Peterson offered none of these visibly. Instead, he offered silence. And silence forces us to sit with ambiguity. Ambiguity is uncomfortable. It denies closure. It denies emotional certainty. This is why discussions about this case often become heated. People are not just arguing facts. They are defending their emotional interpretation of reality. Another haunting element of this case is how it exposes our reliance on emotional performance. We want grief to look a certain way. We want remorse to sound a certain way. We want innocence to behave a certain way. When those performances do not appear, we feel betrayed. But performance is not the same as experience. And this case reminds us that emotional performance is not a reliable measure of truth. That realization is deeply destabilizing because it suggests that emotional cues, the very signals we rely on to navigate trust, are imperfect. Finally, this case haunts us because it challenges our belief in emotional correction. We want to believe that time, punishment, and consequence eventually force emotional reckoning. That guilt grows heavier. That remorse deepens. That people change. Scott Peterson's emotional consistency over time challenges that belief. It suggests that emotional absence may not decay, that some psychological structures persist despite consequence. And if that is true, then justice may not always deliver emotional satisfaction, only procedural closure. This realization leaves us unsettled because it means that sometimes the ending we want does not exist. There is no emotional resolution, no final breakdown, no moment of recognition, only silence. And silence, when paired with irreversible loss, is one of the hardest things for humans to accept. This is why the Scott Peterson case still haunts us, not because it lacks answers, but because it denies emotional comfort. It forces us to confront the limits of empathy, the unreliability of instinct, and the uncomfortable reality that not all minds operate with the same emotional gravity. And once that reality is acknowledged, the world feels less predictable, less safe, and far more complex. At the end of every long investigation, there's a moment where the facts stop moving. Evidence is cataloged, arguments are exhausted, verdicts are rendered, and yet, understanding does not always arrive with closure. The Scott Peterson case ends legally, but psychologically it does not, because what lingers is not a question of guilt alone. It is a question of emotional reality. Throughout this documentary, we have examined emotional absence not as a performance, not as a tactic, and not as a symptom of chaos, but as a stable psychological structure. We have explored how emotional detachment can exist quietly, consistently, and invisibly, shaping behavior without ever announcing itself. And now, at the end, we are left with a final, uncomfortable truth. Some forms of human danger do not look like danger. They do not shout. They do not threaten. They do not rage. They remain still. This realization challenges the way we think about morality. We often imagine moral failure as emotionally charged, driven by anger, hatred, jealousy, or desperation. We expect wrongdoing to come with emotional turbulence. But this case suggests something else. That moral failure can occur without emotional intensity. That devastating actions can unfold without emotional collapse. And that the absence of feeling can be just as consequential as the presence of cruelty. This is not an argument for sympathy. It is an argument for accuracy. Understanding emotional structure does not absolve responsibility. It does not soften consequence. And it does not excuse harm. It simply clarifies how harm can occur without the emotional signals we expect to precede it. This clarity is uncomfortable because it removes the reassurance we seek. We want to believe that terrible acts require terrible emotions. We want to believe that conscience always announces itself loudly. We want to believe that suffering must look like suffering. When those beliefs are challenged, we feel exposed. The Scott Peterson case exposes us to a possibility we would rather avoid. That emotional safeguards are not universal. That empathy is not guaranteed. And that silence can persist even after irreversible loss. This realization forces us to rethink how we interpret people. We rely heavily on emotional cues to judge trust, sincerity, and safety. We look for tears, panic, and collapse as proof of humanity. But emotional performance is not the same as emotional experience. An emotional experience is not the same for everyone. This does not mean emotion is meaningless. It means emotion is unevenly distributed. An uneven distribution complicates justice, judgment, and prevention. One of the most difficult aspects of this case is accepting that punishment does not always produce emotional transformation. We want prison to break people emotionally. We want time to erode detachment. We want suffering to correct absence. But psychology does not promise transformation. It explains persistence. And in this case, emotional absence appears persistent. This does not make the outcome unjust, but it does make it unsatisfying on a human level. Because we crave emotional endpoints. We want a moment where the silence ends, where recognition appears, where something finally breaks. In this case, it never did. And that unresolved quiet is what stays with us. This documentary has deliberately avoided diagnosing. Not because diagnosis is unimportant, but because labels can falsely imply certainty where complexity remains. We have not attempted to name Scott Peterson as a fixed category. We have examined patterns, structures, consistencies, and we have done so not to explain away harm, but to understand how harm can occur without the emotional signals we rely on to anticipate it. This understanding matters beyond this case, because emotionally detached individuals do not announce themselves. They often function well. They blend in. They may never commit violence. But when emotional absence intersects with responsibility, power, and moral choice, the consequences can be severe. This does not mean emotional detachment causes violence. It means emotional detachment removes friction. And friction is often what stops irreversible actions. The absence of friction is quiet. It does not warn. It does not escalate. It simply allows. This is why silence can be more unsettling than rage. Rage burns out. Silence persists. And persistence without emotional correction is what truly disturbs us. As viewers, we are left with a final ethical challenge. How do we judge behavior when emotional signals mislead us? How do we balance empathy with accountability? How do we acknowledge psychological variation without normalizing harm? There are no easy answers, but refusing to ask the questions does not make us safer. Understanding does not weaken justice. It strengthens it, because justice that relies on emotional intuition alone is vulnerable to error. And justice that ignores emotional structure misunderstands human behavior. This case reminds us that evil does not always announce itself with spectacle. Sometimes it arrives without emotion. Sometimes it arrives without drama. Sometimes it arrives without feeling. And when it does, it leaves us unprepared. The silence does not end with sentencing. It does not end with time. It does not end with consequence. It simply remains. And perhaps that is the final discomfort of this case. Not that we lack answers, but that the answers do not bring emotional peace. They bring awareness. And awareness, once gained, cannot be undone. The Scott Peterson case forces us to confront a reality we often avoid. That human psychology is not uniform. That emotional depth is not guaranteed. And that moral danger does not always wear a face we recognize. This documentary does not ask you to feel sympathy. It asks you to feel vigilance. To recognize that emotional absence is not benign when paired with responsibility. To understand that silence can be as informative as speech. And to accept that some cases will never offer the emotional closure we seek. Only the knowledge that silence, once recognized, must be taken seriously. Because when silence has no endpoint, it does not fade. It waits. And waiting, without feeling, is where the most unsettling truths often reside. If this documentary made you uncomfortable, that reaction matters. Understanding cases like this isn't about choosing sides. It's about recognizing how easily silence can be misunderstood and how dangerous emotional absence can become when we stop questioning it. If you choose to engage with this channel, do it for one reason only: to think more carefully about the minds behind the headlines.